you don't know me, I'm a recovering academic. I spent 10 years in academia studying kind of tobacco control research and adolescent smoking behavior. And then after convincing myself of the value of tobacco harm reduction through non-combustible products, I now consult for the non-combustible nicotine industry. I'm going to put my disclosures up just for transparency, but this channel is my own views and doesn't reflect the views of my employers or clients. Those of you who follow me on my other platforms like Twitter, X, or Substack know that I spend a lot of my personal time breaking down new literature on nicotine and tobacco research and kind of pointing out the common flaws in the research. I thought I would try a new video format to see if this goes any quicker and if I can get these critiques out to you guys quicker. So I'm going to focus on this older study today. This was back in, I think, 2017. I saw this paper referenced recently in something else that I was reading, and it was referenced in a way that kind of indicated that e-cigarette use is associated with respiratory symptoms and bronchitis in adolescents. And when I read that, that did not agree with my own experience. I have a paper myself on e-cigarette use and respiratory symptoms, which I'll get to at the end of the video. And first thing I do is I skim the abstract. So it looks at associations of self-reported use of e-cigarettes with chronic bronchitic symptoms. So that's chronic cough, phlegm, or bronchitis, or wheeze in the previous 12 months. Then they go on to describe the association. So the risk of bronchitis symptoms was increased by almost twofold among past users compared to never users, and about the same thing for current users. And then usually with these kinds of studies, there's confounding by smoking history, but these are adolescents who might not have an extensive smoking history. But on to give credit where credit's due, they say associations were attenuated by adjustment for lifetime number of cigarette smoke and secondhand smoke exposure. Most studies don't do this. There's a lot of studies out there that claim to find a respiratory effect of e-cigarettes, but really it's analyzing a lot of people that have heavy smoking history, maybe started using e-cigarettes to taper down or quit smoking, or maybe switched to e-cigarettes completely. But the fact is that they have a long history of smoking that might have lingering health effects that explain the respiratory symptoms, but it's being blamed on e-cigarette use. This study actually did a decent thing by adjusting for lifetime number of cigarettes smoked, which does kind of account for the cumulative cigarette smoking. It might not completely account for other confounding factors, but it does better than 95% of other studies like this out there. And then they also looked at never smokers. So it says risk of bronchitis symptoms among past e-cigarette users remained elevated after adjustment for relevant potential confounders, and was also observed among never cigarette users. That's another good practice, actually, because of this confounding effect where a lot of e-cigarette users either currently smoke or have an extensive history of smoking. So two ways to kind of adjust for that and separate out the effects of the e-cigarette use from the effects of the smoking. One of them is to try to adjust for cumulative lifetime cigarette exposure. And the other way is to look only among never smokers. And this kind of avoids the confounding issue entirely. But the problem is that there's not too many people who use e-cigarettes but never smoked cigarettes. But nonetheless, this paper seems to have done both. And overall, it still finds that e-cigarette users had increased rates of chronic bronchitis symptoms. So at this point, when I skim the abstract, I'm going to go through the full text in a moment, but at this point, it does seem, I got the impression that there might be something going on because they did a fairly good job of trying to account for the obvious confounders like cigarette smoking. But then that's not really what the results show. They're a little bit misrepresented or cherry-picked in the abstract. The middle points, the middle squares here are the numbers that we just reviewed in the abstract. This is the point estimate of the odds ratio. So in other words, it's the best estimate given the data, but there is always some variability in the data. So the range here between the top and bottom value gives the confidence interval of where the true effect might lie. This is unadjusted for anything, meaning that all we know is e-cigarette users have higher odds of bronchitis, but we don't know if it's because of smoking, like they might have been smoking or have some other exposure explaining the bronchitis. This is adjusted for sex, ethnicity, parental education, and community, so kind of socio-demographic factors. And then this cluster of plots is further adjusted for secondhand smoke and the lifetime number of cigarettes smoked. So right off the bat, this is the only useful one, this third cluster over here. And notice this is this is the reference group. So we're saying past e-cigarette users compared to never users have an higher odds of bronchitis. And then current users also have sort of a higher odds of having bronchitis, but the confidence interval spans the null. So if anything is right at 1, an odds ratio of 1 means that there's no difference in the odds of bronchitis. And if the confidence interval overlaps with 1, then that means we can't be sure that there really is an effect here that's different from no effect. So that already seems kind of to tell a different story from what the abstract was saying. This is a similar plot, but looking at the number of days of e-cigarette use instead of whether you currently or previously used e-cigarettes. And again, and this is broken down by 1 to 2 days in the past month versus 3 or more days. Again, these in the adjusted model, they're not significantly different from no effect. So there's no clear evidence here that e-cigarette users have higher odds of bronchitis after you adjust for other things that might explain the bronchitis. Here, same thing here. This is the analysis among never smokers, which really does have the most value in telling whether there's a unique effect of e-cigarette use. None of these really look significant. Like maybe that's barely significant because it's just above the odds ratio of 1. But in the fully adjusted model for current use, there's no difference. There's no significant difference there. So the results are telling a completely different story than the impression I got from the abstract, at least. And when I go back to the abstract, I see that it's very carefully worded, so it's not technically incorrect, but it gives the wrong impression anyway, and I'll show you what I mean. So when it jumps into the main results, it says risk of bronchitis symptoms were increased by almost 2-fold among past users compared with never users, and by 2-fold among current users. Those are both significant results. And by the way, that's not a correct description of odds ratio. It's not that the risk was increased by 2-fold. It's that the odds were increased by 2-fold. It's a different quantity. That's sort of beside the point. What they're doing here is they're reporting either the unadjusted or the partially adjusted model. They're not reporting the fully adjusted model because that one wasn't significant for current users. The risk was higher for past users, but that is not a plausible result that past users would have a more reliably higher risk than current e-cigarette users in terms of bronchitis. That indicates some other kind of confounding. It's not really biologically plausible. So they kind of cherry-picked the not fully adjusted model there to put it into the abstract. And all they say about the adjustment is that associations were attenuated by adjustment. They don't mention the very relevant finding that it attenuates to non-significance among current users. Because again, confidence interval overlaps a null effect, so we can't be sure that there's any difference there. Next, they say, however, the risk of bronchitis symptoms among past e-cigarette users remain elevated after adjustment and was also observed among never cigarette users. That's both referring to past e-cigarette use. So again, they're omitting the finding about current e-cigarette users. And they conclude by saying adolescent e-cigarette users had increased rates of chronic bronchitis symptoms. That's not true. The current ones didn't, actually, after you account for cigarette smoking. It was only the past e-cigarette use, which again is not biologically plausible. I think that's a pretty clear indication that there's some other confounding going on here. Like maybe they were smoking marijuana, maybe they have overall different health status. It's not really clear what's going on, but it doesn't make biological sense that odds can be elevated for past e-cigarette use, but not current e-cigarette use. And there's Obviously, this is just an observational study, so it can't prove causality because of this confounding issue, but it's interpreted as if e-cigarettes are the cause. If these are being interpreted as causal effects, by using that same logic, it would follow that the advice is if you ever used e-cigarettes, you better keep using them currently so that you don't have a higher risk of bronchitis. And that's obviously illogical. But the authors are using the same logical leap to make it seem like e-cigarettes are responsible for higher bronchitis symptoms. So that's a lesson that you really need to look into the full text. The story told in the abstract is often incomplete or misleading. And there's nothing incorrect here. There's no false statements. It all reflects true results that they had. But by selecting which results get reported in the abstract, they tell a completely different story to what the results actually show. They're kind of ignoring the most informative results, which is the adjusted models that account for lifetime number of cigarettes smoked, secondhand smoke, and the ones for never smokers. Those are all non-significant, but the whole overall paper selectively focuses on the inferior results to make it seem like e-cigarette use is associated with bronchitis. So I did a systematic review of all the studies using longitudinal data, not cross-sectional data, because then you can't tell whether the respiratory symptoms happen before e-cigarette use. So longitudinal data looking at e-cigarette use and some sort of respiratory outcome, whether it's self-reported diagnosis or respiratory symptoms in people who never smoked. So this whole data set, this whole paper is about people who never smoked. What we found is that e-cigarette use in people who never smoked is not significantly associated with a higher chance of having a respiratory diagnosis, so like a clinically relevant diagnosis, including bronchitis. There might be evidence for mild coughing or wheezing symptoms, but even in those studies, that was the worst case scenario. In many of the underlying studies, there were other factors not accounted for, such as smoking after the baseline wave that could have explained the outcomes instead. So this is a much more robust analysis because we're focusing on people who never smoked, and that avoids a lot of the other issues. So this is overall a much more reliable analysis. And it's definitely at odds with the findings of the other 2017 paper. So I'll stop there for today, but I thought that was worth going through how an abstract can initially give one impression, but then the underlying data tell a completely different story. Thanks for your attention, and let me know if there's any other studies you want me to cover.